Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library. My name is Gary Gunderson. I'm the supervisory archivist here at the library, and we're very pleased to have such a tremendous turnout on such a lovely spring/summer evening. We would also like to thank the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and Friends of Ford for their financial support of our program this evening. Now, on with the show. Andrew Scott Cooper is no stranger to the Ford Library. Some of you will recall that he spoke previously at the library in 2011 about his first book called The Oil Kings: How the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia Changed the Balance of Power in the Middle East. In his new book, The Fall of Heaven, The Pahlavis and the Final Days of Imperial Iran, I appreciate the shorter title this time, Dr. Cooper focuses on the Shah of Iran, presenting a remarkably human portrait of one of the 20th century's most complicated personalities. The Fall of Heaven traces the Shah's life from his childhood through his ascension to the throne in 1941 and into the dramatic and final days of one of the world's legendary ruling families, the unseating of which helped set the stage for ongoing events in the Middle East today. In researching his book, Dr. Cooper interviewed Iranian royalists and revolutionaries, the Shah's widow, Empress Farah, and members of the Pahlavi family, as well as Iranian and American officials. He also visited Iran and utilized primary source documents obtained from several presidential libraries, including right here at the Ford Library. Dr. Cooper earned his PhD in history at Victoria University in New Zealand and currently serves as an adjunct assistant professor of political science at Columbia University. It is my honor to welcome back to the Ford Presidential Library, Andrew Scott Cooper. Andrew.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be back here, and especially for those of you who were perhaps here five and a half years ago, it's great to be back. So this is the follow-up book to The Oil Kings. And those of you who read The Oil Kings will know that the very last scene is in November 1977 when there was a riot just outside the White House. And this picture was taken seconds before anti-Shah students started rioting, and the Washington Park police fired tear gas. Unfortunately, the breeze was drifting towards the White House, and some of you will remember they were all tear gassed, including the two first couples here, and the famous photo of the Shah wiping the tears from his eyes. And that was really the prelude to the catastrophic events of the next year, 1978. I think that right now the 1970s and particularly the presidencies of Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, are so important to scholars because we see so many continuities between their period right up until today. And especially the fall of the Shah, many scholars now are really concluding that when the Shah lost power and the US lost its closest ally in the Middle East then began a trajectory that led to what I would describe as today's implosion or regional collapse. And that is what we're seeing here. I was in Greece in January talking to Greek historians and asking them, because Greece is bankrupt, but they have a right on the edge of the region. And when I asked them, when do you think the slide began for the whole Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East region, they all said, when the Shah fell. And so what I tried to do in this book was, first of all, do an investigative research on the circumstances surrounding the Shah's downfall. There's so much we still don't know about this event. This is the first televised revolution in history, and yet in a way it is the most puzzling. And especially if there's anyone who's Iranian in the room, Iranian American, who went through the events, many of you probably have Iranian friends. Iranians are as confused by the events of 78, 79 as many scholars are. The reason is that what we saw on television and what you see on television today, it's just the surface. Really what's going on behind the scenes here, how is it that the leader of the most powerful country in the Middle East, who had the 5th largest army in the world, and was, after the leaders of the superpowers, the leaders who had nuclear weapons, the Shah was one of the most powerful men in the world, and he lost power very quickly. And it's very important that we try to understand how he lost power, because as I'm going to talk to you about one of the observations I'll make in my remarks tonight, the Shah was trying to do something that most Americans weren't aware of at the time. He was liberalizing his regime, and in fact, he had a plan to democratize Iran. And he lost power while he was trying to democratize his autocracy. And it's very important that we understand how he lost power and why he lost power, because in the region today, we see other monarchies, other authoritarian regimes that are allied to the US, and they too will soon face the question, the challenge of how do you liberalize, let off steam without losing power. So tonight we're going to look at the past, we're going to look at the present, and we're going to look a little bit into the future and talk about Iran and US-Iran relations. So with my students at Columbia, I'm a historian, I teach political science students. They're usually 20, 21 years old, juniors and seniors. They know nothing of this period. And in fact, I like putting up pictures of the presidents and the world leaders from that period because, unfortunately, many of them can't identify them. And so I'm sort of starting from scratch. But I have to say that once they get really focused on the history of US-Iran relations, they are fascinated. Because who knew that the United States and Iran were so close? The Shah was our guardian of the Persian Gulf. The Shah was one of this country's closest allies, certainly in the region. And so that's also a very important story here. So my work as a historian and a historian of US foreign policy is an effort to explore the roots of a poisoned relationship. These are conflicting, contrasting scenes from 1979, where you have Iranian students on top of the embassy burning the American flag. You have Americans calling for the deportation of Iranians after the hostages were taken. And then to really look at how the past weighs so heavily on the present. So what I would call the two open wounds of the US-Iran relationship is the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953 in a CIA-backed coup, and the taking of the hostages. So this is the open wound for many Iranians, not all Iranians, because there's a very interesting scholarly dispute going on right now about the exact extent of US involvement in the coup. But certainly for most Americans who are aware of this period, this is the dominant image of American diplomats blindfolded, humiliated, and being held captive for 444 days. And then part of my work is also to determine the prospects for our countries to move beyond what I call the history trap. There's no other bilateral relationship that this country has with another country like Iran where the history weighs so heavily on the present. It's almost like we can't evade it, and yet it infuses every public statement, every public policy, and so many of our, of course, public opinion polls. When people, just a couple of years ago, people were asked to compare and contrast Iran and North Korea, which is the bigger threat, and most Americans went for Iran, even though North Korea is the one that has nuclear weapons for sure, has tested them, and is threatening to fire them into cities in California. But Iran remains this very open wound, I think, for many Americans who remember this period. So these are, of course, how the relationship has infused popular culture. You remember Argo from 5 years ago now. The literature on the period, this is Stephen Kinz's book, All the Shah's Men, on 1953. I'm probably leading the revisionist charge right now as a historian who is really opening up this whole period. So this is Fall of Heaven, and then there's a Sally Field movie from some time ago. But it just shows how the relationship has really captured the minds of popular culture. I want to talk a little bit about my work as a historian. I work with documents. I also interview people. I interviewed over 100 people for this book. I interviewed the Shah's widow, Empress Farah. I just saw her a couple of weeks ago in Iran. I'm sorry, I saw her a couple of weeks ago in New York. She won't be going back to Iran, and actually neither will I after the book was written. I was in Iran here though. This is actually outside the house of Ayatollah Khomeini in northern Tehran. And this is it's now a museum. It's not quite a presidential library. It's a house. You're not allowed to go in it, but they have a mosque attached to it where he used to give his fiery sermons. So when I went to Iran, I had a short-term sabbatical to study Shiism. And it was important for me to understand more about Islam. And it was a great opportunity for me to be in Iran. I was treated very well. The people are hungry for contact with Westerners and Americans. Iranian people are remarkably hospitable, and I have to say that it's true what they say. The Iranian people are the most pro-American in the region with the most anti-American government. Go figure. So those of you, maybe someone here has been on one of the tour parties that go to Iran. Everyone who goes has an amazing time. I went on my own, and I was in Qom, which is a theological center for Shiism. And this photo, I think we all look a little shady. A little uncomfortable there. I did a presentation at the Political Science Association of Qom. Qom is where the Ayatollahs live. It is the clerical center for Shiism. So this is how a speech like this would be delivered in Iran. We have Ayatollah Khomeini, we have the current supreme leader, Mr. Khamenei, and then we have my hosts, and this is one of my teachers, and this is the head of my department. And it was a really fascinating, great time. And I also got to visit the Shah's palaces, and that was what I really wanted to see. I wanted to see where the Shah lived, where the royal family lived, and how they lived their lives, and really get into the nuts and bolts of the Shah's interior life. And you can't do that from here. You have to go, and you have to be walking the corridors in the palace that he walked in. You have to be in the bedroom where he slept. I mean, that's what historians hopefully should do. It's what we love to do, is, as Lyndon Johnson used to say, you see it, smell it, feel it, and that's what I like to do too. So when we're talking about this event, we're talking about, at the time it was regarded as a revolution, an upheaval. Now we describe it as a huge epochal event, cataclysm, depending on your point of view, a transformative event that changed not only Iran, not only the Middle East, but Islam, and in fact world history. I watched it on TV as a 9-year-old kid in 1978, and that was the inspiration to write 2 books on it. So it shows the effect it can have on young minds. It certainly shows how the fact this room is packed. People are still interested in the Shah. People love to talk about the Shah, as I've learned in my public lectures around the country. So when we say thinking the unthinkable, Iran in 1977-78, this is what Iran was like. Not all of Iran, but if you were in Iran, you were a young woman who was going to university, you were not veiled, you were wearing Western clothes, you were possibly wearing mini skirts, you were going to discotheques, you were driving a car around town on your own. Not all women, but certainly women who in the middle class, upper middle class, who were being educated. These are very westernized images. Tehran was the hub for Pan Am, for West Asia. Iran had the largest American expatriate community in the world. 52,000 Americans lived in Iran in 1978. I don't know if anyone in this room was one of those people or lived in Iran at that time, but I spent my time interviewing and working with Americans who lived there and went through the revolution. Their stories have never been told, because the hostages were taken and American public opinion decided we don't want to hear any more about Iran. Their stories are amazing. They were airlifted out by helicopters, they were rescued by boats, some of them walked over mountains to get into Iraq or Turkey. But they lived among the Iranians, they learned Persian. Many of them were children who grew up and spent almost their entire formative years in Iran. And then there's the Shah. The Shah was, as I said, the Shah was one of this country's closest allies for 37 years. Here he is with Mr. Truman, Mr. Kennedy. Jackie is giving him a very intense look. We know something about that because she lobbied him to change his prime minister once they were in the Oval Office. Kennedy and the Shah did not have a good relationship, as you see in my book. Mr. Nixon had probably the best relationship with the Shah. They saw eye to eye on geopolitics. And then, of course, you have President Ford, who had, I think, quite a difficult time with the Shah. He inherited this relationship with all its contradictions and complexities, and especially the issue of oil pricing. The oil shock hit Ford's presidency just as he came in and destabilized the US and European economies. And the Shah, of course, as I detail in my first book, the Shah was unbending on the issue of oil prices. He refused to concede the point on oil prices, and that was a real sticking point for them. This is one of my favorite images. This is the time when the US encouraged Iran's nuclear program. And, of course, the US started Iran's nuclear program. If you don't know that, you probably should. It's a good little bit of history. Dates back to Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. By sort of early 70s, it was the Shah really wanted to develop an independent, autonomous nuclear energy program. US companies were very happy to go to Iran. Iran hosted most of the US corporations had headquarters, regional headquarters in Iran, Citibank, Chase, and certainly the Shah was a great customer for US weaponry and also for the nuclear industry. So this is actually a newspaper ad from the New York Times in which the nuclear industry is saying, look, if the Shah can do it, so can we. He did want to do it, and as we know, that this Iranian nuclear project today, it's not just the Ayatollahs. This is not just an Islamic bomb or an Islamic issue. For Iranians, this is a national project. It's a project of pride. It goes back to the Shah's era, and even Iranians who are against the regime, you talk to them about, do you think Iran should have the choice to develop an independent nuclear program? They would say, many of them would say yes. Now, in terms of weaponizing it, that's a whole other issue. But in terms of generating nuclear power, they would say we have a large population, we're running out of water, and we need alternative sources of energy. Most of you remember the Shah in this way, 1967 at his coronation. If you go to Tehran, you can visit the jewels, the greatest jewelry collection, I think, in the world, in the vault under the central bank. It's an amazing experience. The crowns, the tiaras, there are bowls overflowing with rubies, emeralds, diamonds, pearls, sapphires. It's stunning. And you see all this here. And this is 1967. The Shah was at the height of his power. He was the great reformer king at this time. He had launched the White Revolution. He had emancipated Iranian women. He was in many ways the Lyndon Johnson of Iran. That's how I see him. He had a social program that was designed to build a modern welfare state for his people. He believed that his people were not ready for democracy and that he had a direct relationship with them as the king. So, you know, the Shah has been this figure, I believe, when I started my book research, he'd become almost a caricature of who he really was. I mean, you ask people, what do you say about the Shah? What do you think about him? People mention Savak, the secret police. Savak Shah, Shah Savak. Well, there's much more going on to the Shah and in Iran than just Savak. We have to also look at the good things that the Shah did. He did a lot of good things. That's why today, when you're in Iran, there's a whole revival of interest in the Pahlavi family. The taxi drivers in Iran would say, God bless the Shah. They say it to Iranians and they say it to foreigners. Young people gather at the tomb of Cyrus the Great, as they did twice last fall, up to 100,000 people chanting, no country without a king, bring the king home, and then chanting slogans against the mullahs. And they're chanting in support of this fellow who died in 1980. It's important we understand his legacy because this interest in pre-Islamic Persian culture and history right now in Iran is a direct reaction against what's happened since the 2009 crackdown on the Green Movement. And I predict that this is only going to get stronger in the years to come. So we do need to understand it. I have spent a lot of time with Her Majesty Empress Farah. It's been really wonderful. It's always a risk when a public figure agrees to sit with an historian and allow themselves to be interviewed and recorded and statements written down, because it's a gamble. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know if I have an agenda. But I think that she recognized, and many Iranians on the royalist side or the revolutionary side, and former US officials, understood that it's really time to take another look at this series of events from 77 to 79. There are so many misunderstandings. There are so many conspiracy theories. And so many Iranians who lived through this period, frankly, are traumatized by what they went through to an extent that I certainly didn't understand until I spent time with them. I would say that the majority of people I interviewed broke down in tears while I was doing my interviews. It got to a point where I began to kind of shut down myself. I had to develop my own response and technique to deal with that, because I had people who were extremely distressed, including people around the family who had really, many of their friends or family members had been executed after the revolution. They had fled the country with nothing, or they had fled the country and in fear of their lives. The Khomeini, the Islamic Republic, sent death squads out for a good 15 years after the revolution to assassinate anyone they sensed in the exile community who might pose a threat. Just last week, her brother-in-law, the Shah's youngest brother, Prince Gholam Reza, passed away. He is the last surviving son or daughter, the last surviving child of Reza Shah, who was the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty. So we go from the royal family to this fellow. He needs no introduction. He's one of the great revolutionaries of the modern era. And in his own way, he's also misunderstood. And one of my tasks in going to Iran was to try to understand him a little bit better. So it was really wonderful. I went to the mosque where he used to preach in the 1940s. I went to the house where he lived, where he was arrested in 1963 in Qom. I went to his house in northern Tehran, as you saw. And I had an opportunity to interview one of his former bodyguards, who told me how meticulous he was and how disciplined he was and what he did during the day. The striking thing about that was it was very similar to the Shah. I found that it was really interesting, but very different personalities. The Shah essentially was a very gentle guy. That sounds strange for people to hear that now. He was a remarkably erudite. He liked to see himself as an intellectual, though I don't think he really was, but very self-taught, extremely polite. Many stories of the Shah's courtesies, and there was one story where he was walking in his garden at Niavaran Palace, and he had the aide was walking behind him, and the Shah suddenly stopped, and the aide said, "Your Majesty, there's something wrong." And he said, "Do you see that bug?" He had to walk around it. You know, you think that that's a dictator, you've probably got a problem on your hands. In other words, the Shah was not Khomeini. The Shah was not... Khomeini had what I would describe as a totalitarian instinct and personality. He promised democracy, but no one really asked him, what did you mean by democracy? People thought, well, it's going to be a French-style republic. He was certainly coached very well by his French-educated Iranian intellectuals who were around him. But there was no way he was going to bring in a Western-style democracy. He regarded Western-style democracy as profoundly corrupt, and decided that it had no business as part of Islam. And he, of course, is the fellow who develops this revolutionary thesis of Islamic government that we hear so much about today, but is also very widely misunderstood. A large part of my research was investigating what I would describe as mysteries of the first televised revolution. This is Jaleh Square. Most Americans know this as the incident in September 1978 when the Shah's troops fired into crowds, mowed down hundreds of people, and that's officially the start of the revolution. However, if you talk to the people around the Shah, the people at the imperial court, they will tell you that the revolution, to them, the power struggle in Iran between the Shah and Khomeini was over. It ended 4 days before this cataclysmic event happened. Now, I was then faced with the challenge of, well, if the Iranian version is so different from the US version of the Iran, I'm going to have to work backwards, which is why in the book you see me go back and then kind of cautiously work my way forward day by day, trying to reconstruct the events that led up to this tragedy. When I was in Tehran, I walked Jaleh Square because there's so many conspiracy theories about this event. Did people fire into the crowd? Were there thousands of people killed? I had decided I wanted to go for myself, and I just walked around. It's not even a square, it's a circle. But there are other episodes from this, from the revolution. The burning of the Rex Cinema in Abadan in August 1978. Over 400 men, women, and children were massacred. That tragedy was laid at the foot of the Shah and Savak. We now know, and the Islamic Republic has quietly admitted, that those were pro-Khomeini terrorists who lit that fire, burned those people to stoke public panic. In a way, it was almost like the Reichstag fire of 1933 for Germany, and it certainly worked. So there were conspiracy theories that I had to untangle, and there were basic causes of the revolution, which we can talk about in our Q&A session as well. But I want to just look at a couple of these first. What you had going on in the 1970s, not only in Iran, but I would say here, because what we have in the 1970s, one reason why the decade's so interesting, you have liberalism colliding with conservatism in a very interesting way. 1970s sees the rise of what we call the Christian right in the United States, the ascendant with Ronald Reagan in 1980. The Catholic Church is going through a similar period of turning from liberalism to more conservatism under John Paul II. Islam, Shia Islam in particular, is going through a similar phenomenon, similar trajectory. So as a historian, I have to understand, and I was very curious as to why this was happening in Iran, growing interest and sentiment and religious fervor, and also in the United States, and also in a country like Poland, remember. At exactly that time, the Catholic Church in Poland is sheltering Solidarity trade union workers. Well, in Iran, at exactly the same time, the mullahs were sheltering left-wing Marxist students in the mosques. You had a similar phenomenon going on that is something that is, I think, very interesting. Within Iran, Iranian society becomes very disoriented by westernization, modernization, which is encouraged by the US. And of course, Khomeini is the one who says we have to go back. We have to purge ourselves of all this corruption, and I'm the one who's going to take us back to purity. And in fact, he essentially does. He takes them much further back than they planned or even wanted, I would argue. But certainly the images of the Shah and the family on the cover of Ola magazine, you know, you can imagine, I mean, just compare and contrast. The Shah is wearing sort of pajamas at the beach. So there's an enormous backlash against Western-style values, Western-style modernization that has been encouraged by successive US presidents and administrations in Iran and in the Muslim world from really the 1950s onwards. The US pumped billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, into Iran. I mean, it's a fair question, what happened to the investment? You know, the investment went down the toilet, but not necessarily the whole investment, as we will talk about in a minute. In terms of the final crisis in Tehran, the American, the US attitude is Jimmy Carter lost Iran, Jimmy Carter's to blame. That's what Iranians will tell you. That's not taking responsibility for your own behavior, your own actions. You know, the fact is that when I went through the archives at the Carter Library, I was pretty stunned because Carter doesn't become personally engaged in the revolution until Jaleh Square. And as I've just mentioned, for the Iranians, For the Iranian elite, Jaleh Square was the end, it wasn't the beginning. So the question is, why did the US take so long? Why was the White House so unaware? When you go through the paperwork from that year of crisis, what's fascinating is that the embassy is busy doing their thing, collecting documents and trying to study what's going on. But it's not like there's an intelligence failure, but there's certainly a failure of imagination. No one in Washington can conceive that the Shah is going to be ousted. No one can conceive at all that there's going to be a religious revolution. Even after Khomeini came back, when you're looking at Brzezinski's notes to Carter, they believed the Communist Party was going to possibly succeed and win in Iran. Actually, Khomeini came in and wiped them out. But here we had in Iran sort of classic end of empire crisis going on, where you have the Shah becoming himself disoriented at the turn of events and starting to replace prime ministers willy-nilly, trying to find that right person who can fill the job for him. And he can't. And he has Prime Minister Amouzegar, Sharif Imami, he has General Azari, and then he has the last one, Prime Minister Bakhtiar. So he goes through 4 prime ministers in about 15 months. There's no stability, there's no continuity. At that point, people who are loyalists to the Shah start to lose faith and start to panic, and people start to leave the country. The court is divided between conservatives and liberals. The Shah is unsure which way to go. The former, I say, right-wing, more conservative people want a military crackdown, which they believed could save the day. The liberal faction at court, which is very influential by that time, believes that they should push forward with liberal reforms to democratize the country. The Queen is very much in support of that. Neither the King or the Queen want a bloody crackdown for a couple of reasons. One, they both know, and no one else knows, that he is slowly dying of lymphoma. So those of you remember, the Shah comes to New York in October 1979, after he was ousted, to have surgery. His entry into the United States then leads to the students in Tehran storming the US embassy and taking the hostages. But you can see here, he's lost a lot of weight. He was being medicated by French doctors who were flown in every 2 weeks. The Queen was only told in 1977, 3.5 years into the process, that her husband was dangerously ill. So neither of them believed that a crackdown, if they believed that their son, who was only a teenager, could not inherit a blood-stained throne. And I think they were right. A crackdown would have destroyed the monarchy. But for people who were in the royalist camp at that point, late in the day, they believed it was coming to an end anyway, and they believed a crackdown with or without the Shah was essential. The crackdown doesn't happen. And then we have the 2 heads of Savak. The Shah fires General Nasiri, who was later executed by the revolutionaries, and replaces him with the more liberal General Moghadam. General Moghadam, unbeknownst to the Shah, I believe, has betrayed the Shah to Khomeini over the summer of '78. So it's also a very Shakespearean story going on here, where as the regime starts to implode, people start to run for the exits. They start to take money out of the country. They start to quietly reach out to the revolutionaries. If I work with you, are you going to help me afterwards? Don't hurt me, don't hurt my family. Most people think that all Iranians were against the Shah. It's just not true. In fact, many, many Iranians stayed loyal to the Shah to the end. There's a good case to be made that the Shah could have made a different calculation and actually rallied the Iranian people to his side. Most people think that the entire Shia clergy was against the Shah. That's not true. We now know that there was a power split within the clergy. What I would describe as the fundamentalists, centered around Khomeini, were in the minority. The moderates, around the Grand Ayatollah Shariat Madari, were much more numerous, but they lacked the spirit and the fire and, frankly, some of the violent instincts of the Khomeini people, who eventually overwhelmed them. My book is making waves in Iran and Lebanon because of this character here. Imam Musa Sadr, I won't go into the story, but he is a famous character within Shiism. According to the traditional story, the Shah eliminated Musa Sada because he was pro-Khomeini. The new evidence suggests that Musa Sada is eliminated by the people around Khomeini because he is in secret, as I reveal, he was in secret contacts with the Shah. So there's a lot of backstory intrigue going on in this story that we had no idea was happening. Even Iranians didn't know this stuff was happening. And I also wanted to look at the US side. Now, I'm going to wrap up my remarks in a minute, but I want to quickly talk about this policy vacuum in the White House, which is very important, whichever period we're in, whether it's today or whether I won't get into the details, given the headlines, but it is so critical to understand how important it is to have unity at the top in the superpower. It is so important that you have a president who's engaged, that you have Secretary, State, Defense, National Security Advisor who are working as a team. Sadly, that did not happen under Jimmy Carter in '78. You had the Secretary of State, Vance, really detached. At this point, from what I understand, he had become more or less a pacifist. Brzezinski favored a harsh crackdown. Actually, by the time they had that debate, as I inferred earlier, it was over. So when you're going through their documents, you're reading the debates thinking, you guys are wasting your time. Iran is already lost. This is Ambassador Sullivan, who, of course, is at the embassy. The embassy was stormed twice, by the way. We know about the big one, but earlier in the year it was taken as well. And that's him surrounded by Mujahideen. And then what I like to call distractions from the main event. How did these events suddenly explode into public view? And then we're left thinking, hold on, how did 9/11 happen? How did something happen now we didn't know what was the build-up to it? Well, in 1978, there's some reasons why the Carter administration was so thoroughly distracted from events in Iran. First of all, they thought the Shah could manage the crisis on his own. The Shah did not like to be told what to do. Despite conspiracy theories that the Americans were pulling the strings, the Shah was very much his own man by 77, 78. So they had a hands-off attitude. The Carter White House was, the summer of '78, which is the critical time, completely consumed by the Camp David peace accords. A very good reason to be completely consumed, but it is puzzling to me, and I've seen it subsequently in administrations, how with this vast bureaucracy, the people at the top, handful of people, are focused on one issue or one crisis. Things start to fall apart on the periphery very quickly. So while this great diplomatic bargain is being negotiated, the Shah is fighting for his life, and there's not one diplomatic dispatch or White House analysis of what's going on in Iran in the summer of '78. Remember, '78 was the year of 3 popes, and in fact, two of them died within 30 days of each other. That period coincided with August, September, October '78. And if you look at US newspapers and the news magazines, the popes were on the cover. That was the big story for US public, US television, US newspapers, and it's a great story. Now, historically, John Paul I died. Did it merit all that coverage? It probably did at the time. Looking back, we would say that the rise of Khomeini was probably more important. And you all remember Jonestown. It's remarkable what happened in '78. I mean, '78 is one of those years where the roof caves in. And with the 1970s, it feels like the roof caved in the whole decade. 1978 ends with these 2 linked events. The assassination of Mayor Moscone in San Francisco and Harvey Milk, the first elected gay city official in American history. They are assassinated within 10 days of the mass suicide at Jonestown. This is all happening at the same time. So I always give policymakers and officials, I give them some credit for they can't control the world. Who knew Jim Jones would commit suicide with 950 people? On the other hand, it is a sobering lesson in leadership and how you have to have a president and you have to have a national security team who are on the same page and they are fully engaged and understanding what's going on in the world. So even when we had a very experienced team here, you had this catastrophe break. And I'm not sure if the US could have done anything at the end of 78. This was an Iranian story. It was an Iranian tragedy. It was playing out in Iran among Iranians. There were things the Carter administration failed to do, neglected to do, could have done better. But the rise of Islam that had started really after World War II, but taken off after 1967 and the Six-Day War, that revival of Islam was unstoppable. You can't stop something like that. No single leader can. No one's going to make a decision to say, well, I don't think there should be a militant revival of Islam. You know, I mean, here we are today. So we're in a different phase of it. But the Shah was the first one, if it's, you know, in terms of a bowling pin, the Shah's the first one to get knocked down. And it's very important to understand, I think, how that happened, why it happened, and what we can do when the next challenge comes. So I can't believe I've spoken for 45 minutes, but apparently I have. And rather than me talk, I'd like to take some questions from you. And if we have any questions, otherwise I'll keep talking. I did 2.5 hours in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago, so believe me, I can be like Che Guevara, Fidel Castro. You'll be here until midnight.
First of all, I'd like to thank you. You accomplished something that I think is very difficult, and that is to include some terrifically fascinating details throughout the book, and yet the narrative never bogged down.
Thank you.
So I just really applaud that.
Thanks.
My question is about a quote in the book, and it's influenced by maybe the lack of being able to find a center in the U.S. right now. And I'm curious if this was possible and what the Shah maybe could have done differently. The sentence is, Khomeini's campaign of intimidation combined with Sharif Imani's, if I pronounce that,
Prime Minister
concessions brought a sudden ignominious end to the Pahlavi dynasty's half-century effort to balance Iranian religious tradition with secular government and Western-style modernization. Was such a balance possible? And how do you see the Shah doing something different to allow that? You mentioned one time his one set of reforms angered both the right and the left.
Right. And that's the risk when you push through groundbreaking reforms in a society like that. He alienated the aristocracy and the clerics who were on the right, and he also alienated the left. He was trying to co-opt the people on the left. In that sense, he was a bit like LBJ. His policies, I would say long-term, here's the irony about that question, but Iran today, is that Iranians today are more interested in seeking that balance between modernization and Islam again than they were in the 60s. In the 60s and 70s, it was imposed from the top down. And I think many Iranians would say, you know, we didn't really understand what the Shah was trying to do. The Shah slowed down. This is a guy who's moving very fast because he wants total executive power. It's always very dangerous. He believes that the system is calibrated around his personality, and so he didn't have constitutional checks and balances. So he is moving very quickly, and he was warned by people around him in the family and also advisors, please don't go, you're going too quickly. Why are you going so fast? He believed that he had this time to reform Iran within his lifetime. The plan was he was eventually going to transition out, liberalize, and then fully democratize. It's always interesting. Most people, myself included, did not understand that the Shah made an announcement in middle of 78 that he is going to hold full free parliamentary elections in Iran in the summer of 1979. Can you imagine if he'd been able to hold on for another 6 months? It's really remarkable. Part of I think the tragedy that killed him in the end, apart from the cancer, is he was so close to achieving his goal of this phase out. Modernization in the 60s and 70s was done not only in Iran, but in other developing current countries, encouraged by US, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, fast It was backed up by scientific analysis. There were economists who were they called it there was a whole economics theory. You had to basically jumpstart your economy by pumping all your revenues into industry, and then you would take off like a rocket. Well, unfortunately, the rocket kind of goes up and then comes down and crashes, because commodity booms do that. Saudi Arabia is a country to look at right now. Saudis are trying something similar, and I don't think it's going to work. So in terms of modernization, there's more possibility it would work now, because the Iranians are more aware and sensitive to possible backlashes that can develop.
Thank you.
Hello. My question is not as erudite because I have not read your book. Nevertheless, two comments, if I may. You use democratization and democracy, both in referring to the Shah and to Khomeini, but quite differently, as if the use of democracy by the Shah was somewhat benign, and the opposite with Khomeini. But really, I would think one could argue that they were both using liberalization and democracy to foster very specific aims that have very little to do with creating a democratic nation. In the case of the Shah, he was undermining the Bazarjis, redistributing the land, which can all be seen as progressive, but there are also power plays. In the case of Khomeini, you said that he brought around that there was a semblance of unity early on, which happens early in revolutions. He brought the leftists next to him. But of course, I don't think there was any ambiguity at all that he was aiming towards a revolution, an Islamic revolution. And to put it in context, this is only possibly the second revolution in the entire history of Islam. If one wants to think of the Abbasid revolution as the first one, these are not my words. This is from Saeed Arjumand, whom I heard a long time ago. So this is a big, big deal. We're probably in the middle range effects of this revolution, which, whether we like it or not, has created a stable nation. A stable nation that has been, yes, relatively stable within its own boundaries for whatever, now nearly 40 years. What did Saudi Arabia bring us? Something like called ISIS, a Sunni revolution under which we're living right now. So, there's a silver lining to this revolution, I think.
Well, there are silver linings to it. I mean, Iran has been on a search for democracy for over 100 years now, since the 1905-06 constitutional revolution. And I think you see this tension in Iranian history over the past century. What do we mean by democracy? How the Shah is not the right person to reintroduce democracy in Iran in the late 70s, early 80s anyway, because once you have gathered executive power yourself, the problem is no one trusts you when you say, I'm going to give it back. So that was the problem with the Shah. The Shah, I believe, really, he knew he had to do it. He's dying. His son couldn't inherit the throne, but he also was having serious problems with the economy. He understood, he was smart enough to know this authoritarian system is not going to outlast me, but he left it too late. Iran did have this functioning democracy in the 1940s, a little bit in the early 50s, a little bit in the early 60s, and it gets quashed again. Khomeini, I don't think people understood in 78 Khomeini. I would say even many of the people around Khomeini did not understand who Khomeini was or what he wanted. Even though he had written his thesis on Islamic government, it was remarkable to talk to former US officials in the embassy. You could actually get this thesis on street corners in the bazaar. They knew about it, but they never bothered to go down and get it translated. Had they read it, they probably would have avoided doing what they did, as you see in my book, where the diplomats open a back channel to Khomeini's people in late 78 and make it clear they would like the Shah to leave and Khomeini to come back. I always believed that was a conspiracy theory and totally until I interviewed the officials who were involved in the back channel, and they were very uncomfortable talking about that today because it didn't work out so well. People make mistakes, and with policymakers and diplomats, we have to be really careful because it's that hindsight thing. But I don't, Khomeini was coached by the people around him to say that they would, foreign correspondents would say, what kind of democracy do you want? He said, like the French Republic. Bani Sadr, who I interviewed, the first president of the Islamic Republic, told me, yes, the reporters would give their questions in the morning. This was when he was in Paris. Khomeini was in Paris for those last couple of months. We would write the answers, give them to Khomeini, and he would memorize them, and then he would have his 15 minutes with the press, and he would tell them what they wanted to know. That sounds probably, that's what happens in revolutions too. What's really interesting is that, and this is something that I don't think anyone really knew until I talked to people who said, well, actually, we had him wiretapped. We had Khomeini's phone conversations. CIA had his phone conversations tapped. They were also tapping the Shah's palace. They had the Queen's phone line tapped. And then you think, well, how could they make so many mistakes if they had, you think about the NSA today, all the intelligence gathering. Does anyone really think all those trillions or millions of pages are going to be properly processed, analyzed? And then what? What do you do with it all? The story of Iran's democracy, transition to democracy, is certainly not over. I think the Islamic Republic is is going to either transition or die, because too many Iranians are unhappy with that regime. But the point that the questioner made about Iran being at peace is totally true. When you're in Iran, Iranians will grumble, but they will say, at least we're not Syria. And that's very important. That's very important. No Iranian wants to see their country split. Iranians, doesn't matter what side they're on, are horrified that the United States supports the Mujahideen. I mean, it's a cult. And to see Senator McCain with the leader of the Mujahideen, I think it was in Albania last month, was stunning to Iranians living in this country. The Mujahideen assassinated American military personnel in Iran in the 1970s. So, this is a story that is ongoing, and whereas the Iranians have all this retentive memory, in this country, I think too often we're just seeing Iran as it is today, but we have to sort of understand some of the trajectory here. Next question, thank you.
Hi. Historians deal generally with the past, but with the experience of the past and your knowledge of the past, can you turn up your crystal ball and see if you can come up with some ideas as to what situation we'll be in 10 years from now when the regulations of the you told us
we might be in Canada.
you told well, you told us that the Iranians have a population that likes Americans and a government that doesn't. And you mentioned just now that you're hopeful that there might be some change in the government that would be more.
Well, I think Iran is a country. Yeah, I think Iran. When you look at Iranian history, Iran is a country that is. I think it's a very flexible, fluid society and heritage. I think it's very different to the Sunni side, which we don't have time to go into. But it's a very dynamic entrepreneurial society, and when you're there, it's an odd feeling. I think even there are many people in the regime who are unhappy with how the regime functions. I know that because I'm aware of who they reach out to complain, and it's outside Iran. I think that people around Khomeini, including members of the Khomeini family, are actually now in the opposition. Some of them have been locked up and sent to jail. So Iran is not like, this regime is not this homogeneous entity that is like just a big dictatorship where one person is in charge. Actually, there are competing power centers, and the challenge for US diplomats is to try and work out which power center do we work with. It was, when I visited Iran, I went through the foreign ministry so I wouldn't have to have dealings with the security ministry. The security ministry is the one, the foreign ministry might approve you to come in. The security ministry might say, sorry, but you're not leaving. So this is why I don't go back. And by the way, I was under cyber attack when this book came out. My laptop was infected. I was attacked all over the internet. The Islamic Republic has trolls, paid trolls, that they use to attack people like me who they suspect are engaged in any sort of historical revisionism. This is that whole narrative that the regime is built on. The irony is that they love my first book. Oil Kings is translated in Tehran. I've got a copy of it. It's in Persian. It's wonderful. So it's a very sort of capricious regime. And they've studied the downfall. The people in charge, Mr. Rouhani, they were the revolutionary generation. They know how to overthrow regimes and dictatorships, and they have think tanks dedicated to their own survival. But that doesn't mean they're not going to have another revolution. It doesn't mean they're in there forever. Iran has had multiple regime changes over the past several thousand years. Dynasties come and dynasties go. And I think that sometimes we give too much import to the current regime and power. The Iranian people, if they're happy, they'll keep it. If they're not happy, then eventually something will happen.
I have two short questions. One's a big one, which is,
I like those ones.
how could this have happened if he had, I think you said, the fifth largest army in the world? How could someone in charge of that large an army not prevent a revolution of the sort that happened? The second, much smaller question is, because I knew him a decade or so before all this, Sadegh Gotspeda.
Oh, yes.
He became the Ayatollah's foreign minister, and then he was shot by the Ayatollah. What
That happened a lot.
can you shed any light on what happened?
Yeah, well, the first question was on use of force. The televised images would have you believe that the Shah had the army out killing thousands of people. We have the death toll for the entire revolution. It's actually remarkably low. The Shah refused to issue orders. The reason why he lost power is he refused. His generals were begging with him, please let us use force, because they were out on the streets in martial law. And the Shah was repeatedly saying, I don't want a single bloody nose from with an Iranian. I will not tolerate any live rounds. And he said, if the crowds get out of control and you have to open fire, fire below the knees. The generals were very demoralized. The conscripts became confused, and they were out on the streets for too long. The soldiers ended up fraternizing with the civilian population, which is always very dangerous in a system like that. This was the Shah's personality going back his whole life. He was very soft. And Iranians will tell you, Iranians outside the country will say, their criticism of him is the opposite one human rights groups have. The Shah was a brutal dictator. Many Iranians will say, no, he was too soft, and had he been more like his father or like his sister Ashraf, we would still be in Iran. The second question, Mr. Gotspeda, I think he doesn't come out very well in the story of the revolution. He is dispatched after the revolution by Khomeini because he becomes involved in a military. He realizes, he's one of the people who, from the left, who realize after Khomeini comes in, oh, we made a mistake. We need to do something about it. So he is involved in a military plot. The military plot is found out, and the officers and Gotspeda are executed. His mistress, one of his mistresses, who was a renowned womanizer, wrote a very interesting memoir that very people know about. I think it's called something Persian Mirror. She was a Canadian journalist, and she wrote this very interesting memoir about her time with him all through the revolution. And it's fascinating to read that account. And she was very much in love with him, and he was very much in love with everyone. But you do notice that Khomeini is a very tough character. The people who come in are either executed or exiled. Very few of them survive. Mr. Rafsanjani was one of the only ones who really did, and Mr. Khamenei, who's the supreme leader today.
Short, specific question. How much does the Western-backed overthrow of the Iranian government in the 50s affect the relationship and the animosity between our countries today? Is that something the Iranian people have a long memory of and they remember it? Because no one in this country remembers it.
No one in this country remembers it. Iranians do remember it, and the current regime makes sure they do remember it, but I think it's overemphasized a little bit too much now. It's been 60 years. Like I say, there's a very interesting scholarly debate going on about the extent of the US role, but the US was involved. So the US is tainted by the overthrow of this government. Mossadegh was not democratically elected, though. That's a bit of a misnomer. The Iranian parliament nominated him for the role of prime minister. So the Shah approved his nomination to the prime ministership. This is outlined in my book, and there's a power struggle between them, between the royalists and the secular leftists, the National Front people. Mossadegh becomes a martyr to democracy. It's not clear how much of a Democrat he really was either, because he too started to gather executive power in the year before he was overthrown. But certainly, you know, this is the same problem with the US in Chile, Guatemala, Dominican Republic. You know, when you go in and you overthrow these governments, or Iraq today, you overthrow governments short-term, oh, it's great, we have what we want. The long-term psychological wounds to that society are very deep and long-lasting. And that should be factored into policy making. But because officials are working short-term, thank you, it was very good. It was a year, thank you. Short-term, daily, weekly, monthly, they're not thinking far ahead enough. And that's one thing I think Kissinger has said, the luxury of being the academic. And then once you're in that office, it's on, all systems go all the time, and you're working multiple.
Maybe something related to that. I'm wondering if you can shed a little light on something I read after September 11th, within a few days or weeks. Reportedly, the Iranian government sent a letter to the Bush administration. And this letter was sympathetic and also requesting to meet. Everything's on the table. And my understanding is that it went unanswered by the administration. Can you shed any light on?
Yeah, they as my understanding is they did make an offer, and that was a blown opportunity. Things happened at that time that we still fully don't understand, but certainly Iran saw that they had a president at that time who was a so-called reformer, Mr. Khatami, and he expressed public sympathy with the American people. In Tehran, people lit candles, they held vigils, and there was an enormous wellspring of sympathy for this country at that time, and that evaporated pretty quickly, especially with the axis of evil speech, where Iran, for some reason, is listed as part of the axis of evil. I mean, Iran wasn't involved in 9/11 at all, and Iran was not trying to overthrow the US government, or I think it's when you have ideologues getting involved in foreign policy, it doesn't matter what side they're on. I tend to get very nervous about that. They come in like a bull in a china shop. And I think even David Frum, who wrote that speech, regrets that line now. And I don't know, it would be, eventually we'll know how that speech was crafted, but certainly the Iranians wanted some kind of opening, and that opening was just shut down. And I think that was a mistake.
Yes, going back just a few years, how much power did Ahmadinejad have? And I think I'm getting his name right, from a few years ago. I'm sorry? How was it?
President Ahmadinejad?
Yeah, President Ahmadinejad, yeah. And also, I don't know how much power did he have, but how did he get to that position to have that power also?
He was the elected president, so he was...
But how was he? But he must have somehow been selected to run or something.
Well, they have a selection process where you have to be a regime loyalist to run. They're not going to allow someone to run who wants to overthrow the system. Well, I'm having a hot flash. He was the president, but the supreme leader is the one with ultimate power in terms of policy. So the president is allowed to do certain things. You know, Ahmadinejad had a big mouth on him, and he loved to whip up a crowd and say outrageous inflammatory things. And I was interested when I went to Qom just after Rouhani came in. And I was in the seminary with the mullahs, the turbans, and granted this was a pro-Rouhani, I think, probably crowd, but they were so relieved. I mean, they attached words like the devil to Ahmadinejad. They hated him. And they hated him because he was threatening to bring down the system. They believed he was so unpopular with the Iranian people, had become so unpopular. He had core constituents, it's 40%, but he had 60% were against him. And that 60% were losing faith in the regime very quickly. And, you know, when you're running a system like that, you better have someone in who's going to try and clean it up or reform it or bring more people back in. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. It's going to become unstable. So the Iranian elections are later in this month, and, you know, Mr. Rouhani, I think, will be allowed to win. He was allowed to win last time, and that's called letting off steam in the Iranian tradition. When the too much pressure is building up in the system, you let off steam. The Shah used to do that. I mean, all Iranian leaders have done it. You sort of loosen the valves a little bit, you allow some protests, some little bit of dissent, let people let off steam, and then you suppress it again. But there's a danger there, because if the timing is off and you loosen the valves, it's like a volcano. The whole thing can blow up. And that's what happened under the Shah. And so, but the current regime, they know this stuff. But I think that probably the supreme leader, he's older, he's been, I mean, Iranians would say we've been recorded, so. Let's put it this way, he's in, you know, supposedly in ill health, but I would imagine that he just wants to transition out, and whatever happens after he goes, if the system's flexible and fluid enough, they probably, I think they should not have another supreme leader. They should say, he was so great at what he did, so perfect, we can't possibly emulate him, and so we should not have another supreme leader. We should have the president and the executive French-style system. And, you know, that would actually be very interesting to see what would happen then. Traditionally, the role of the senior Mahdi in Shiism, you know, that person doesn't have to be living in Iran, the so-called supreme leader, which is a term invented by Khomeini. But they could say, well, the new senior figure in Shiism is going to be Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who lives in Najaf in Iraq. And that used to happen under the Shah a lot. So that would be a Persian-style arrangement where it would work. It could possibly work. But we're going to have to see. It's going to be fascinating in the next couple of years how it plays out in Iran.
And if I could ask also, what is your nuclear agreements that were made before? Because you really don't get, at least I get the real feel of really, did they give away too much? Is it too lenient, or are there teeth to it? And I'm just curious on your feel.
Well, I mean, I was at the Nixon Library in September, and I said something about how it was many Los Angeles Iranians were there, and I said I basically supported the concept and the deal, and then it was this. I am for constructive diplomacy, and I think it was time. I think this is a building block. We have to look at it as a building block. This is the first time the United States and Iran, since the revolution, have actually worked on something constructively, and it's a foundation for the future. And you can build a lot on that. Are there things about the deal that scholars or experts didn't like? You bet. But I believe it's in the interest of the Islamic Republic to maintain that deal. I believe that they know they need an opening to the West for investment and also as a valve to let off some pressure inside. I believe there are strategic reasons why they need that deal, and I think there are reasons why we should want that deal to survive too. And you certainly don't come in and throw out something that's been negotiated for I don't know how many years. I mean, painstaking diplomacy for years and years. So this is something to start with, and that's how I see it. And I think that if we can weather the storm of different elections and systems and people coming in, you know, Iran and the United States have a future together in the future. I don't know what system they're going to have, but I do believe that given the similarities between the two peoples, there is some commonality of interest there on both sides. And, you know, when you look at the history of the US and Iran, dating back to the 1820s, and, you know, formal diplomatic relations were established in 1883. Most people don't know that. So we basically had 100 years of diplomatic relations. We've had 38 years of a rupture. But that, you've got to look at what worked as well as what didn't work, and then you have to hope or try and make sure you don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And but it's a story that is going to go on for a long time, and I don't know, I like to think I'm optimistic even though I'm a historian, and let's face it, things often don't work out as we would like. You're about ready? I think we had one more question.
My question has to do with how Iranians see themselves. I've known 3 people well enough from Iran. One was in the early 60s, the other late 70s, about the middle of the revolution, the other afterwards. And in all 3 cases, they described themselves as Persian, not Iranian. And I'm wondering why, because I think of the country of Iran, not Persia. I think of, you know, a long time ago.
Well, that's a good question. It was Persia until Reza Shah changed the name in 1935 to Iran. And then it became Iran and Iranians. However, since the revolution, Iranians, it's mainly older Iranians or Iranians who detest and oppose the current regime, prefer to say they speak Persian or they talk about Persian culture. Many younger Iranians say Farsi. There's a debate within the Iranian community, actually, because Fars is a province within Iran. So a literalist would say, well, you can't say you speak Farsi because it's just Fars, the province. But it's become a political ball in a way. I think as a scholar, I prefer Persian because to me, it's a little more neutral, but it's hard. It depends on the audience. People often don't know what Farsi means, but they know what Persian is. So it's a political and cultural issue. And I chose to go with Persian because of the time period I was writing about.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for the excellent presentation. We have an assortment of Ford 1976 campaign memorabilia as a gift. There actually is a lot of stuff in this little bag, so I was astounded when the staff kept pulling stuff out. And we also have a 1976 campaign poster that we're packaging up separately, which will look great in your office or possibly the guest powder room.
Great fridge.
At your home. So there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for the terrific questions. One quick program announcement. We have actually a June program this year, which is kind of rare. So on June 6th, acclaimed writer, journalist, and documentary filmmaker Chris Whipple will be here to talk about his new book, which is called The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. So I think that's rather timely as well. And that book covers the Nixon through the Obama administrations. And some of you may recall the documentary with the same title, which came out in 2014. So this is actually the book version of that. And lastly, if interested, we do have forms available for joining Friends of Ford, signing up for email announcements for future programs, as well as providing feedback on our program this evening. And now it's my pleasure to invite you to meet our speaker, get your book signed, and enjoy the reception in the lobby. Thank you very much for coming tonight.